November 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The chill of an early winter bite. The air, thick with the scent of pine and spent cordite, carried the deep, throaty rumble of Allied heavy transport. The tide of the war had decisively turned, but victory was a muddy, exhausting business, and the front line was now a chaotic smear across Europe. This was not the glamorous conquest seen in newsreels. This was the slow, brutal sorting of the wreckage left behind. In the hastily converted command post, a once grand Belgian manor now stripped bare and smelling of stale cigarettes, the American High Command was preoccupied with logistics, fuel, ammunition, and the ceaseless flow of prisoners. Millions of men were now stripped of their weapons, their ideological fury replaced by a desperate, hollow fatigue. Yet, the story we tell begins not with a defeated man, but with a woman, and the strange, uncomfortable power she held in the midst of American authority. The irony of this stage of the war was immense. The great Allied push to liberate Europe was, in some ways, creating a new, vast infrastructure of confinement. They had prepared for the German soldier, the fanatic of the Wehrmacht, and the ruthless ideologue of the SS. What they had not prepared for were the subtle, complex human beings caught in the collapse of the Third Reich, the auxiliaries, the forced labor, the technicians, and, most difficult of all, the women. Enter Corporal Arthur Hayes, 24 years old, an engineer by trade thrust into the role of a provost martial guard. Hayes was a man of quiet, meticulous observation, far more comfortable with the precision of a slide rule than the sloppiness of combat. His tour of duty had placed him not in the heat of battle, but in the colder, morally ambiguous environment of a rear-echelon prison camp, a compound of barbed wire, temporary sheds, and an overwhelming, demoralizing silence. The atmosphere in the camp was thick with contempt. A defeated enemy, reduced to labor, was a target for small, petty revenges, the release valve for months of pent-up fear and sacrifice. The guards, exhausted and emboldened by their victory, sought ways to assert their absolute dominance. It was into this environment that Elsa Richter arrived. Not a combatant, but captured near a dismantled V-2 launch site, a place of sophisticated technology and high-level secrets. Her official papers vaguely identified her as an administrative auxiliary, a non-combatant. Yet her hands, though dirty, were not the rough hands of a common laborer. She carried herself with a rigid, almost terrifying composure, her gaze missing nothing. The soldiers in the camp, fueled by resentment and cheap liquor, devised a crude, mean-spirited joke. They dragged Elsa from the processing line and shoved a bucket and a brush into her hands. The assignment: scrub the manure-stained floor of the motor pool latrine, a task usually reserved for the most despised male prisoners. It was meant to be a deliberate, profound act of degradation, a final stamp of her defeated status. They wanted to see her break. The group of guards watched, expecting the tears, the protest, the final collapse of dignity. But Elsa, without a word, simply began to scrub. The meticulous, almost scientific way she approached the foul task was unnerving. She didn't weep or rage. She simply executed the command. Hayes, overseeing the logistics of a supply convoy outside, heard the coarse laughter and followed the noise. What he saw was a scene of calculated humiliation, but what held his attention was not the shame, but the terrible inefficiency of the act. The entire point of the war machine was productivity, and here they were, wasting time and degrading a potential source of intelligence for a cheap thrill. As the other guards watched, snickering, Hayes walked past them. He stopped next to Elsa, who continued to scrub, her eyes focused only on the tiles. The silence of the moment was profound. The laughter died down, replaced by a confused tension. Hayes did not look at her, but at the lieutenant who was presiding over the spectacle. "Sir," Hayes said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, "this prisoner is documented as being picked up near the V2 installation at Lüttich. The priority directive from G2 states that any personnel associated with advanced German technology are to be flagged for high-level interrogation, not manual labor. If she is an auxiliary, she handled sensitive documents. If she is a technician, she possesses technical knowledge we need." He didn't make a moral argument. He made an argument of strategic necessity. The lieutenant, a man named Brody, bristled, offended by the logic disrupting his fun. It's a morale booster, Corporal. Let the kraut clean up her mess. Hayes stood his ground, maintaining his rigid military posture. Respectfully, sir, wasting a potentially high-value intelligence asset on floor scrubbing is poor military policy. We should process her, according to the standing order, and let the analysts decide her worth. If she's a nobody, she'll be scrubbing floors in 2 days anyway. The argument was irrefutable. It was the language of the modern industrial war that the U.S. Army understood best. Efficiency. Brody, seething, was forced to concede. Fine, Hayes. Take your prize. Process her yourself. She's your responsibility now. He spat the words out. But if she turns out to be a waste of rations, it's on your record. Hayes simply nodded. The other guards watched in disbelief as he reached down, took the bucket and brush from the German woman's hand, and set them aside. He looked at Elsa Richter for the first time. There was no gratitude in her eyes, only a deep, guarded suspicion. The joke had been cancelled, not by morality, but by the cold logic of intelligence gathering. Hayes had saved her from a moment of humiliation, but he had not acted out of pity. He had acted out of a conviction that even in war there must be a purpose for everything. He didn't know it yet, but by treating her as a resource rather than a defeated enemy, he had unwittingly opened a terrifying door to a secret that ran far deeper than the V-2 rockets, and he had tied his own fate to that of the Ghost. Do you want to uncover the secrets held by the defeated? Hit the subscribe button and join our channel. Your support helps us tell these untold stories of courage, strategy, and the harsh choices made in the fog of war. The prison annex, 48 hours later. The shift in Elsa Richter's circumstances was dramatic, yet subtle. She was moved from the communal holding pen to a small, isolated room in the annex, designed for special handling. The lighting was harsh, the walls bare concrete. This environment was designed not for physical pain, but for relentless psychological pressure, the slow erosion of willpower. Corporal Hayes, now burdened with the administrative headache of his high-value prisoner, was tasked with monitoring her initial processing. He was not an interrogator, but his engineering background had made him a reluctant consultant for G2 analysts struggling to decipher the complex blueprints found near the V2 site. The irony of the situation was the clash between American technical arrogance and German technical superiority in certain spheres. The Americans believed their production power could overwhelm any German invention, but the V-weapons, the jet fighters, and the intricate communications networks suggested a leap in innovation the Allies were still scrambling to understand. The interrogators, led by a Colonel Marsden, were specialists in the old school. Loud questions, threats of deprivation, and the constant assertion of Allied dominance. Their early sessions with Elsa were a symphony of frustration. Excerpt from historical G2 interrogation report, adapted. Subject Richter exhibits a highly unusual level of internal discipline. She responds with precise, minimal data, names, dates, serial numbers, only when the information is already known or verifiable. She refuses any generalized knowledge of the V-weapon program beyond her stated administrative role. Her technical responses are highly educated, almost evasive in their precision. She is not a simple clerk. Colonel Marsden resorted to playing the classic game of the Allied intelligence officer, presenting her with fabricated documents, attempting to catch her in a lie. Tell me, Richter, these documents detail the new launch coordinates near the Rhine. Are you familiar with this region? Elsa's responses were clinical. I am familiar with the topography of the Mittelrheingebiet. The coordinates you present, however, are incompatible with the known launch requirements for the A4 assembly. The surrounding infrastructure would not support the required telemetry. She didn't deny the existence of the launch site. She merely pointed out the technical flaws in the fake evidence. She wasn't lying. She was correcting their homework. The room was immediately filled with the subtle tension of intellectual defeat. The engineers in the room understood. She was not merely administering the program. She was fluent in its intricate language. Hayes observed this dynamic through a one-way mirror. He recognized her precise technical vocabulary. He saw that her knowledge was not just rote learning. It was systemic. She understood the why, not just the what. Hayes realized the flaw in Marsden's strategy. They were treating her as a criminal to be broken, when she needed to be treated as a fellow engineer to be intellectually challenged. The interrogators were asking what the Nazis did. Hayes knew they needed to ask how they did it. Driven by his own engineering curiosity and the lieutenant's threat hanging over his head, Hayes began to study Elsa's file, cross-referencing her known location with technical documents. He discovered that the unit she was attached to was responsible for the integration of guidance systems, a critical bottleneck in the entire V-weapon program. This was the heart of the mystery. The Germans were losing the war of production, but they were winning the war of innovation. Later that evening, after Marsden had retreated in frustration, Hayes was assigned the overnight watch on the annex. He saw his opportunity, not to interrogate, but to engage. He carried a small folded piece of paper, a scrap of a V2 blueprint he had struggled to interpret, detailing a complex series of servo mechanisms. He entered the room, setting a ration of coffee and a stale donut on the small table. "I'm not a general, Fräulein Richter," he began, his voice low and even. "I'm an engineer. My name is Corporal Hayes. I worked on hydraulic systems before the war." Elsa looked up, her expression unreadable. She spoke English with a precision that hinted at an educated, privileged background. "The American Army does not send its engineers to guard its prisoners, Corporal." "No," Hayes admitted. "But they send their engineers to understand their enemy's failures, so we don't repeat them." He slid the blueprint across the table. "This design," he pointed to a cluster of symbols, "the integration of the 3-axis gyroscope with the pitch control actuator. The tolerance is too tight for the expected vibration during ascent. It seems inherently unstable." Elsa's eyes, which had been dead and distant, suddenly focused. The challenge had been issued, not by an enemy soldier, but by a peer. It was a language she could not ignore. She leaned forward, her composure momentarily cracking, replaced by professional exasperation. "The tolerance is necessary because the guidance loop must compensate for the non-linear thrust decay of the aggregate 4 engine." She paused, then a spark of genuine disdain crossed her face. "You assume your American tolerances are the only way to achieve stability. We achieved it through complex internal feedback, not simply brute mechanical strength." Hayes felt a rush of intellectual excitement. She had just confirmed her technical role, not through fear, but through professional pride. He had found the crack in the facade. She was a technocrat, and technocrats value truth and intellectual honesty above politics. "So you were involved with the stabilization mechanics," Hayes concluded, "not just administration." A shadow passed over her face, the realization of what she had given away. "The function of the component is irrelevant, Corporal," she said, pulling back her mask of aloofness. "It is obsolete, and I am a prisoner of war." But the secret was out. Hayes had established a line of communication based on a shared reality. The laws of physics were the same for both sides. He now knew 2 things. Elsa Richter was a key player in German rocketry, and her weakness was her commitment to technical accuracy. This was the key to unlocking the greater, darker secret she clearly guarded, a secret far more dangerous than the already terrifying V2. The following week, the camp near Verviers. Hayes's unconventional approach had yielded tangible results, a deeper understanding of the V2's guidance failures. Colonel Marsden, grudgingly, permitted Hayes to continue his technical consultation, viewing it as a harmless way to chip away at the prisoner's resistance. The irony was that Hayes was not trying to break her. He was trying to understand her. He began bringing her more blueprints, discarded schematics, and even technical papers seized from the V-weapon labs, always under strict supervision. Their dialogue transformed from interrogation into a strange, detached academic discourse, a bizarre island of intellectual purity in the surrounding squalor of the war. During one such session, Hayes presented a document detailing the assembly procedures for the rocket's aluminum skin. It seemed innocuous. "The rivet count here seems excessive, Fräulein. Over-engineered for the load-bearing requirements." Elsa looked at the page, her face pale beneath the harsh bulb. "The rivets are not for the skin, Corporal. They are for the shroud." "The shroud? What shroud?" "The payload bay shroud," she whispered, her voice dropping to a near inaudible level. She suddenly stopped, her eyes wide, the technical detachment replaced by raw, untamed fear. She clutched the edge of the table, her knuckles white. "Fräulein Richter," Hayes pressed, leaning closer. "What is in the payload bay that requires a reinforced shroud? The standard explosive package is just Amatol." Elsa shook her head, a silent, desperate negation. "It is nothing. It is obsolete. Burn the document. Please, Corporal, I beg you. You do not understand what you are asking." This reaction was the key. She hadn't flinched at discussing engine combustion, pump performance, or the pressures of fuel delivery. But the moment the payload was mentioned, the engineer vanished, replaced by a terrified woman. This was not the standard fear of a defeated enemy. This was the terror of a secret she truly believed could kill them both. Hayes retreated, his mind racing. The V2, though devastating, was a conventional weapon, a giant, high-speed artillery shell. But what if the engineers of the Third Reich, facing inevitable defeat, had been working on a truly apocalyptic Plan B? The statistics of the V-weapon program were staggering, a relentless drive by Hitler's regime to achieve a technological miracle to reverse the tide. They threw unimaginable resources at it, building underground factories and sacrificing thousands of slave laborers. Why such an enormous effort for a conventional explosive payload? Hayes began to discreetly pull G2 files concerning a notorious SS research division known as Sonderlaber V, Special Laboratory V, associated with the rocket program, but operating with total autonomy. The reports were fragmented, heavily redacted, and dismissed by most analysts as Himmler's esoteric fantasy projects. They dealt with non-conventional warheads, chemical, biological, but one section kept recurring, a theoretical study of isotope concentration and the potential for a dirty bomb. The suspicion was a cold knot in Hayes's stomach. The excessive rivet count, the reinforced shroud, these were the markings of protection against something highly volatile or radioactive. He returned to Elsa the next day, not with a blueprint, but with a moral gambit. He placed a photograph on the table, a picture of a smiling, dark-haired American girl. "This is my sister, Fräulein Richter. She lives in New York. The city is undefended against your rockets." Elsa looked at the picture, her face softening for a fleeting moment of shared humanity. "I need to know what you shielded," Hayes continued, his voice calm but intense. "Is there something in that payload that is not high explosive? If your superiors knew defeat was coming, what was the last weapon they tried to create?" Elsa finally broke, not into hysterics, but into a chilling, technical confession. "It is not ready. It was not ready. That is what I need you to know. They were building a container, the reinforced shroud. It was designed to carry radioactive waste from the production of heavy water reactors. Not a bomb, Corporal, not an atomic explosion, but a device to distribute a plume of highly concentrated, irradiated particulate matter over a large civilian area. The terror was in the details. This wasn't science fiction. It was a plausible, if desperate, leap from conventional warfare. The dawn of radiological terror." Elsa continued, her voice trembling but gaining urgency. "They called it Project Ghoul. My job was the guidance system for the container's final release trajectory. The last operational prototype was moved out of Lüttich before your troops arrived. It was moved east, into the Harz Mountains, to a facility known as the Fortress." Hayes absorbed the information. The ghost, Elsa, had revealed the blueprint of fear. He was now holding a secret that G2 had dismissed as fantasy. The danger wasn't just in the weapon itself, but in the fact that it was likely still operational, sitting in a final Nazi stronghold, waiting for a desperate order to launch against a major Allied port or a liberated city. The irony was devastating. The joke of making a German woman scrub a floor had led him to the threshold of an apocalyptic discovery. He had refused to let her go out of strategic necessity, and now that necessity demanded a terrifying, impossible action. The next morning, the Provost Marshal's office. Hayes was faced with a chilling dilemma. He possessed information about a nascent radiological weapon located in a known SS fallback position in the Harz Mountains. But his source was a high-value enemy prisoner who had cracked under pressure, a confession easily dismissed by skeptical senior officers. He tried to file an emergency report, documenting Elsa's confession. Colonel Marsden, after reading the summary, laughed, a dry, dismissive sound. "Corporal Hayes, you've been spending too much time alone with your Fräulein Ingenieur. Project Ghoul. Radioactive waste dispersal? This sounds like pulp fiction designed to scare a starry-eyed American boy. The Germans are desperate. They are feeding us rubbish to tie up our resources." Marsden's skepticism was rooted in the historical reality of the time. The German propaganda machine was notorious for spreading rumors of miracle weapons, Wunderwaffen, to maintain morale. The American intelligence community was highly focused on the known threats, V-1, V-2, and the Messerschmitt Me 262 jet. The idea of a radiological dispersal weapon was simply too far beyond the established threat matrix. "Sir, she provided specific technical details," Hayes insisted. "The shroud, the heavy water connection. She fed you what you wanted to hear, Corporal. The German mind is a maze of technical precision and Baroque fantasy. Confine the prisoner and concentrate on processing the V2 blueprints. We are done with this ghoul nonsense." Hayes was blocked by bureaucratic inertia and the pride of an officer who refused to be contradicted by a subordinate. The irony was sharp. The military machine, designed for defense, was now too rigid to recognize the true evolving nature of the threat. That night, Hayes made a decision that broke every rule of military conduct and placed him squarely in the realm of high treason. He had to act independently, and he needed Elsa Richter, the ghost, to do it. She was the only one who could guide him to the fortress. He waited until the late-night shift change, when the perimeter guards were at their most complacent. He went to the annex, not in his guard uniform, but in plain fatigue coveralls. Elsa was sitting upright on her cot. She seemed to be expecting him. "I tried to tell them," Hayes said, his voice flat. "They won't listen. They think you are lying." "They believe what they want to believe, Corporal," Elsa replied, her gaze steady. "They have won the war. They do not believe in ghosts anymore." "The coordinates you mentioned," Hayes continued, ignoring her fatalism. "The Harz Mountains, the fortress. I need to know how to get in." Elsa stared at him, comprehending the enormity of his suggestion. "You are suggesting espionage against your own army. You are asking for a military trial and a firing squad, Corporal. And you are sitting on the knowledge of a radiological weapon that could wipe out a liberated city and give your dying regime the propaganda victory it craves," Hayes countered. "I'm an engineer, Fräulein. My job is to prevent catastrophic failure. You can guide me to the site. I can disable the delivery system. We stop the launch. You and I are the only ones who know the full equation." Elsa considered his proposal. She was a German nationalist, but her loyalty was to science and the German people, not the apocalyptic fanaticism of the SS. The launch of a Project Ghoul device would be an act of senseless final nihilism, poisoning German soil alongside Allied lives. She saw in Hayes a shared professional dedication, a man who valued the fix over the fight. "The fortress is a former potassium mine designated Installation 05, Elsa finally conceded, her voice a low, urgent murmur. "The access is a service tunnel near the old rail yard, but it requires a high-level security clearance, biometric scanning, and a specific electronic keycard. Even if you get there, the door will not open for a man wearing an American uniform." Hayes smiled, a tight, grim expression. "I'm an engineer, Fräulein Richter. I am excellent at fabricating what I need. What I need from you is the technical schematic of the electronic locking system, the biometric parameters, and a reason for the two of us to be traveling together." She saw his resolve. This was no longer a joke or a moral quandary. It was a high-stakes adventure against time, bureaucracy, and a fanatical enemy. Over the next 3 nights, operating under the pretense of late-stage interrogation follow-up, Hayes and Elsa created their cover story and their tools. She drew, from memory, the complex circuitry of the SS keycard, the intricate layers of redundancy, and the unique frequency it transmitted. Hayes, using materials scavenged from the motor pool and the radio shack, began fabricating a makeshift electronic key copier and a temporary travel document. Their cover story was audacious. Elsa would be transported under guard for a high-level technical assessment of a captured V2 assembly in a rear area. a perfectly plausible military operation in the chaos of the front. Hayes forged a requisition order for special transport of high-value asset, signing it with Colonel Marsden's forged signature. The moment of truth arrived in the pre-dawn hours. Hayes led Elsa to a commandeered jeep he had deliberately misfiled from the motor pool registry. He stood before her, handing her a worn American field jacket to cover her prison fatigues. "You have one chance, Fräulein Richter," Hayes stated, looking directly into her eyes. "You guide me to that weapon. We neutralize it, and I return you safely to Allied custody. If you try to escape, or if you lead me into a trap, you will discover that an engineer is far more ruthless than a soldier." Elsa, the ghost, pulled the jacket tightly around her. For the first time, a flicker of something akin to trust appeared in her eyes. "The weapon must be destroyed, Corporal. It is a poison. Let us go." Hayes started the jeep. The deep, steady engine hum was a cover for the frantic beating of his heart. He was now a deserter, a traitor, and an accomplice to a POW, driving straight into the heart of what remained of the Reich, hunting a weapon his own army refused to believe existed. The journey of the Sentinel and the Ghost had begun. The road to the Harz Mountains, late November 1944. The strategic terrain was a character in itself. The Harz Mountains, a spine of dark, unforgiving rock and dense forest, was historically a place of German myth and refuge. Now it was a designated Festung, a fortress, a final rallying point for fanatical SS units and the custodians of the most toxic elements of the regime. The irony of their journey was that Hayes and Elsa were traveling deeper into enemy territory. Yet the real enemy was often the chaos and confusion of the collapse. The front lines were fluid. Communication was a patchwork. American supply columns, roving German Wehrmacht stragglers, and local resistance fighters all shared the same roads, operating under different, overlapping rules of engagement. Hayes drove the jeep hard, relying on his forged papers and, more importantly, on the inherent tendency of men in authority to accept what looks official. The cover story held up. An American corporal transporting a high-priority technical consultant. Their greatest asset was Elsa. Her knowledge was not just of rocketry, it was of the German military mind. She knew the location of the best hidden SS checkpoints, the current radio silence protocols, and the paranoia of the commanders guarding the inner sanctum. "We must avoid the main road through Nordhausen," Elsa instructed, her voice precise, pointing at a map Hayes had scrounged. "That area is already being targeted by Allied bombers. The SS will be on high alert, looking for saboteurs, not Americans. We take the old timber trail. It is slower, but they will not expect a military vehicle there." Hayes understood the strategy. They weren't fighting a pitched battle. They were exploiting a cognitive blind spot. The fanatic mind, rigid and focused on grand strategy, ignored the messy, inconvenient details of the terrain. One afternoon, they came upon a roadblock manned by an assortment of tired young SS replacements. Barely men, but armed with Sturmgewehr 44 assault rifles and a terrifying indoctrination. The smell of burning leaves and apprehension hung in the air. The SS corporal approached the jeep, his face a mask of suspicion. "Your papers. And why are you transporting a Fräulein in the uniform of a prisoner?" Hayes, sticking to the cover story, remained strictly military. He spoke in broken, authoritative German. "These are orders from G2, Western Command. She is a specialist, Dr. Richter. She is assessing captured equipment. We are on priority status. Do you question the authority of the Führer's technical experts, Corporal?" He used the Germans' own fanaticism against him, appealing to the Reich's religious belief in technological superiority. The SS corporal examined the fake travel document. His eyes flickered to Elsa. Elsa, realizing the moment of psychological crisis, leaned forward, her face utterly composed, and spoke in perfect technical German. "Corporal, every minute you delay us is a minute that Allied bombers are not tracked by the new radar assemblies we must install. If you believe your duty is to the Reich, clear the path." She didn't plead or show fear. She used the tone of a high-ranking intellectual superior addressing a grunt. The SS corporal, overawed by the technical authority and the perceived urgency, snapped to attention. "Pass, Herr Doctor," he muttered, quickly pulling the barrier aside. Hayes drove through, his hands slick with sweat. He looked at Elsa, who had already retreated behind her mask of professional detachment. "You are an astonishing liar, Fräulein Richter." "I am a good actress, Corporal," she corrected him. "I simply use the language of their self-importance. Their greatest weakness is their inability to conceive that someone like me, or like you, would dare to defy the structure they have created." Their shared danger began to forge an undeniable tense bond. They were two highly intelligent people from opposed worlds, now united by a moral equation that transcended flags. Hayes realized that Elsa was more than just a key. She was a partner. Her insight into the German psychological and physical landscape was invaluable. As they got closer to the destination, the air grew thicker with a palpable sense of secrecy and dread. The roads became clearer, swept by military detail. The civilian population had vanished, replaced by armed patrols. This was the territory of the fortress. Elsa pointed to a barely visible, overgrown maintenance track veering off the main road. "The rail yard is 3 kilometers down that track. The main access to Installation 05 is there. We must abandon the Jeep. From here on, any military vehicle, especially one with American markings, will be a death sentence." They parked the Jeep under a canopy of thick pine trees, covering it with brush. Hayes checked his minimal gear. A canteen, a small pack of explosives he had borrowed from the engineer's supply, a forged keycard, and his standard-issue sidearm, the faithful Colt M1911. As they started the final trek on foot, Hayes looked back at the Jeep, his last connection to the civilized, ordered world of the U.S. Army. He was now a ghost, accompanying one, moving into the earth to confront a dark technology of pure terror. The irony was complete. To save his side, he had to trust his enemy completely. The great adventure of their lives was about to go underground. The abandoned rail yard, deep in the Harz Mountains. Midnight. The silence here was not peaceful. It was a heavy, industrial silence, the quiet of a place waiting to be woken up by dark purpose. Elsa led them through the wreckage of the rail yard. The ground was littered with rusted scrap, the remnants of railway cars carrying coal and potassium, a perfect disguise for the movement of sensitive V-weapon components. She pointed to a low, unassuming concrete structure built into the side of a sheer cliff face. The secondary maintenance entrance. It was built to move components from the fabrication bay to the underground laboratory. Hayes approached the steel door. It was thick, reinforced, and sealed with a high-security lock. This was the final, technological test. He pulled out his crude yet precise field-fabricated keycard duplicator. It was a metal box wired to a small battery, a piece of engineering ingenuity born of desperation. Elsa dictated the necessary electronic signature, reading the precise frequency and modulation of the SS biometric key from the memory she had committed to him days ago. "It is a triple-layered signature, Corporal. 3 sequences of pulse code modulation, tied to a passive identification chip." Hayes worked meticulously, his engineer's focus absolute. The first sequence copied. The second. He heard a tiny, high-pitched click from the box, signaling the replication of the third sequence. He had created the electronic ghost key. He slid the forged card into the reader. The small LED light, which had been stubbornly red, flickered, then turned a solid, reassuring green. The heavy steel door released with a loud, hydraulic hiss. They stepped inside. The air was cold, damp, and smelled of earth and ozone. They were standing in a narrow tunnel, the access to Installation 05. The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber, a relic of the old mine, now brilliantly lit by arrays of fluorescent bulbs. The cavern had been transformed into a sophisticated multi-level factory and laboratory. Below them, workers in dark uniforms moved like ants, assembling components under the watchful eyes of armed SS guards. The statistics were horrifying. This vast, hidden infrastructure was a testament to the Reich's commitment to its technological death rattle. The labor was almost certainly forced. Slave labor pulled from concentration camps, working under atrocious conditions to build the ultimate terror weapon. The irony of the German war effort was that they built miracles of engineering on the backs of the enslaved. Elsa pointed to a segregated area on the lowest level, shielded by steel caging and operating under a separate ventilation system. That is the clean room. That is where the Project Ghoul device is being finalized. As they moved through the shadows, Hayes noted the technology surrounding them. Radar tracking stations, high-frequency radio equipment, and complex guidance telemetry. A fully self-contained V-weapon assembly site. They moved stealthily, relying on their plain clothes and the cover of the ambient industrial noise. But suddenly, a deep, earth-shaking vibration filled the air. "What is that?" Hayes hissed. Elsa looked up, her face etched with a realization that turned her blood cold. "That is the pre-launch sequence. The fueling pumps. They are preparing to move the weapon to the launch bay. They are preparing to fire." The timeline had compressed violently. They were not here to disable a stationary lab experiment. They were here to prevent an imminent launch. The SS, knowing the Allies were closing in, were executing a final desperate act of terror. They had to get to the clean room immediately. They navigated the gantries and scaffolding, avoiding the beams of patrolling searchlights. Hayes, drawing his M1911, knew the stealth phase was over. He pointed to a small secondary control room overlooking the clean room, the only way to disrupt the sequence without a direct assault on the heavily guarded assembly floor. "We go to that control station. You know the shutdown sequence for the guidance system. I will provide the cover," Hayes commanded. They burst into the control room. Two German technicians, engrossed in their pre-launch checks, looked up in stunned surprise. Hayes did not hesitate. Two precise shots from the Colt, non-lethal, aiming for the shoulder, dropped them both. Hayes secured the door. Elsa rushed to the main console, a complex panel of vacuum tubes, rheostats, and wiring. "The master guidance lock must be initiated through this panel," she cried, her fingers flying over the dials. Below them, on the assembly floor, the main lights came on. An SS officer, alerted by the gunfire, looked up and spotted them. "Alarm! They are in the control room! Achtung!" Hayes pressed himself against the reinforced glass of the control room window, firing warning shots to keep the SS from storming the stairs. "Hurry, Elsa. How much time?" "The fuel pumps are at 80% saturation. If the fuel reaches 100%, the launch sequence is irreversible for safety reasons. I need to access the trajectory overwrite and lock the guidance loop." The fate of a city, London, Paris, Antwerp, was now in the hands of two people trapped in a concrete box. One an engineer in a stolen uniform, the other a former enemy technician, fighting against the final seconds of a fanatical machine. The irony of their shared purpose had reached its terrifying climax. The clean room control station. Seconds remaining. The roar of the fuel pumps below was deafening, shaking the entire cavern. The lights in the control room flickered, drawing power for the critical pre-launch cycle. Hayes was pinned down. SS guards had reached the gantry and were returning fire. The thick glass of the control room was spider-webbing under the impact of the high-velocity Mauser rounds. He had enough ammunition for maybe 30 seconds of sustained defense. "Elsa! Status!" Elsa, her back to the violence, was completely immersed in the console, her concentration absolute.
She was a woman possessed by a technical imperative, no longer a prisoner, but a scientist fighting her own corrupted creation. "The console demands a 6-factor authentication key for the trajectory overwrite," she yelled over the noise. "The final protocol was installed after I left. I do not have the final code." The irony was brutal. She knew how the system worked, but not the final bureaucratic lock installed by the SS to prevent sabotage.
Hayes realized the truth. The SS knew the only way to stop a launch was through the guidance lock. They had created a technical dead man switch. Think, Elsa. Who installed it? Who was the lead engineer for the security layer? It was Dr. Klaus Reiner. He was a fanatic. His authentication would be personal, political, not technical. Hayes reloaded his M1911, the metallic click a stark sound in the chaos. A political code, a slogan, a date? He remembered the early interrogation reports, the constant, sickening propaganda of the Reich. He was fighting a war of words as much as bullets. The SS always uses the date of the Munich Putsch or the night of the Long Knives. Try the earliest date. The one they glorified the most, Hayes shouted, pushing his weapon over the sandbags to return fire. Elsa hammered the numeric keypad, entering the date of Hitler's failed beer hall putsch. 9/11/1923. The console flashed. Access denied. It must be the most recent one, Hayes insisted, ducking as a heavy-caliber round blew a chunk of concrete from the wall behind him. The one that marks the true power. The night of the long knives. 6:30, 1934. Elsa's fingers, stained with machine oil and grit, struck the keys again. The console flashed. Access granted. Trajectory overwrite initiated. A new screen appeared, displaying the flight path. The final launch trajectory was set for London. The irony was palpable. The war was almost over, but this last ghost of the Reich was aimed at the heart of the capital that had endured the Blitz. Elsa typed furiously, inputting the override coordinates. She was not aiming for a target. She was aiming for failure. She keyed in the GPS coordinates for the center of the Harz Mountains, the precise location of Installation 05. Below, the SS officer, seeing the flashing lights on the console and realizing the sabotage, screamed into his radio, "Abort the launch! They are overriding the guidance! Block the gantry! Block the gantry!" Hayes took aim and fired 2 shots, destroying the main junction box of the gantry elevator, stranding the bulk of the SS force below. He had bought them 2 minutes. "Done!" Elsa shouted, leaping back from the console. "The trajectory is set for a local, contained failure. It will fly less than 3 kilometers and impact directly back into the mine." "We need to destroy the launch command console," Hayes demanded. Elsa grabbed a heavy aluminum wrench from the workbench and, in a fit of scientific rage, smashed the console's main terminal. Smoke poured from the ruined circuits. The overwrite was now irreversible. They had done it. They had neutralized the weapon. But the fight was far from over. The heavy steel door of the control room buckled under the impact of concentrated small arms fire. Hayes threw his remaining pack of plastic explosives onto the ruined console, setting the short fuse. "Out! Now, Elsa! We have 30 seconds!" They scrambled through a narrow, low ventilation shaft that Elsa remembered from her blueprints, descending into a dark maintenance tunnel just as the plastic charge detonated. The control room became a flaming wreck, isolating the SS from the rest of the launch controls. They heard the heavy, earth-shattering boom from the main cavern. Not the launch of a V2, but the sound of the command structure imploding. The lights in the mine winked out, plunging the entire Installation 05 into darkness. The roar of the fuel pumps, no longer controlled, went wild, then sputtered to a stop. Hayes and Elsa were alone, trapped in the dark, silent bowels of the earth, the survivors of their own desperate subterranean battle. They had won, but now they faced the challenge of escaping from a furious, trapped enemy. 30 minutes later, the outer tunnels of Installation 05. Hayes and Elsa navigated the maintenance tunnels using a flashlight, the silence now broken only by the sound of rushing water and the distant muffled shouts of the trapped SS. The climax of the story had been achieved. The Project Ghoul launch was prevented. The weapon, the first radiological terror device, was aimed at a massive, contained failure deep within the earth, minimizing the dispersal threat. As they reached the old rail yard exit, pulling themselves back into the cold, damp air of the Harz Mountains, the emotional and physical toll hit them. Hayes, bleeding from a superficial wound, was exhausted. Elsa, though composed, was visibly trembling. "We did it," Hayes whispered, leaning against the cold concrete. "It is over." "It is not over, Corporal," Elsa said, her voice sharp. "We must still deal with the consequences." The strategic and moral irony of their journey was about to reach its final resolution. They had defeated the enemy's terror weapon, but Hayes was still a deserter, and Elsa was still a high-value enemy prisoner. They spent the next 3 days moving west, avoiding the main Allied movements, relying on Elsa's knowledge of the terrain and Hayes's ability to scavenge supplies. Their alliance had evolved from strategic necessity to grudging respect, cemented by the shared trauma of the underground battle. Finally, near the Allied lines, Hayes made the final hardest decision. He couldn't simply walk back in with his high-value asset and explain the events. His story would be dismissed as a delusion, or worse, a cover for an elaborate attempt to aid a high-ranking German spy. The risk of court-martial and the immediate dismissal of the Project Ghoul threat was too high. He found a small, isolated forward outpost, manned by a single radio operator. He contacted his former base, identifying himself. "I need to report the location of a high-value asset, Colonel Marsden," Hayes said, his voice level. "Prisoner Elsa Richter. She escaped and was apprehended by local partisans. They are holding her at grid reference X-ray 7 Delta." He gave a location 3 kilometers from where he actually was. He then pulled Elsa aside. "I am returning you to the army, Fräulein, but not as my accomplice. You will be reported as an escapee recaptured by a resistance group. You will tell them everything about the radiological weapon. You will tell them that I was right." "And what about you, Corporal?" Elsa asked, her voice betraying a hint of concern. "I am going to rejoin my unit," Hayes stated grimly. "I was lost in transit during a convoy move. My forged papers will be destroyed. I'm going to erase the record of the last week." He was choosing the path of silence, of the unacknowledged hero. He was trading his own glory and exoneration for the certainty that the intelligence would be taken seriously. A prisoner recaptured by partisans with a wild, terrifying story was far more likely to trigger an investigation than a corporal who broke regulations and was suspected of collaboration. The ultimate irony: to get the truth heard, he had to become a technical liar. He handed her a small piece of paper. "This is the name and number of a Captain Reynolds in G2, a man who knows my work. When they interrogate you, demand to speak to him. Tell him I told you to use the code phrase, 'The tolerance is too tight.'" Elsa nodded, a rare expression of respect on her face. "You risk everything, Corporal." "Why?" "Because, Fräulein Richter, a true engineer must always correct the fatal flaw in the system." The fatal flaw was their belief that technology should be used for ultimate destruction. "I have corrected the flaw." He watched her walk to the designated area, a solitary, resolute figure, the ghost, returning to the light. Hayes returned to his base 3 days later, offering a vague, plausible explanation of being disoriented during a convoy attack. The punishment was administrative, a reprimand for minor dereliction of duty. Colonel Marsden, never having connected the lost corporal to the recaptured prisoner, was simply relieved to have the annoyance over. But the story did not end there. Elsa Richter, using Hayes's code phrase, triggered Captain Reynolds' attention. The subsequent deep interrogation, backed by the discovery of the imploded Installation 05 by Allied scouting units, confirmed the devastating truth of Project Ghoul. The radiological threat was neutralized, and the technology was locked away, far from the world's eye, preventing the creation of an entirely new dimension of warfare. Corporal Arthur Hayes was never publicly recognized. He finished the war quietly, returned home, and became a successful engineer, his story buried deep in classified intelligence files. The story of the Sentinel and the Ghost remains a testament to the fact that, in the darkest hour of the global conflict, the most profound acts of courage were often driven not by flags or fury, but by the cold, clear, and uncompromising logic of a shared professional conviction. The war was defined by the industrial scale of death, but it was saved by a moral equation that transcended the battle lines. If the moral complexity and unacknowledged heroes of World War II intrigue you, make sure to like this video, share it with a friend, and click the bell icon to subscribe. We dive deep into the classified history, strategy, and technology that shaped the modern world. Your support ensures the untold stories of World War II continue to be told.